When people find out that I'm a psychologist, one of the first things they often ask in this kind of half joking, but actually half serious way is, so are you like psychoanalyzing me right now? I quickly reassure them that no, I am not psychoanalyzing you right now, even though really I'm not totally sure what that term means when people use it. But I am really curious about people, and I'm especially curious about people's habits of mind. And something I've noticed about successful people, and I use that term successful pretty broadly here, is that on the one hand, there's a lot of things you would expect. They tend to be hardworking, they're reasonably smart, they have good energy, that sort of thing. But they tend to have another quality that's less obvious, but I think at least as important. Successful people have an uncommonly healthy relationship with themselves. For example, one of the marks of having a healthy relationship with yourself is that you don't fall into self-criticism too often or too intensely. And while highly successful people tend to be quite ambitious, but also very honest and reflective about their mistakes, they also seem to avoid the more unhealthy end of that spectrum, where they don't fall into things like negative self-talk, rumination, chronic worry, things like that. Of course, there are plenty of people who are very successful and have a terrible relationship with themselves, but the exception doesn't prove the rule. And it's my experience that when you look carefully at people who have achieved and sustained a significant amount of success in their life, often one of the sort of hidden factors underneath the surface is that they are especially good at not getting derailed by their own thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and other difficult inner experiences. In other words, it's a lot easier to be successful when you have healthy habits of mind. That said, here are 7 mental habits of highly successful people that I think we can all learn from, regardless of how you define success yourself. Number 1, they acknowledge their emotions early. It's hard to be successful in any aspect of life if you constantly get overwhelmed by your emotions. Of course, we all feel difficult emotions from time to time, things like anxiety or anger, frustration, sadness, stuff like that. But why is it that some people get so stuck in them and overwhelmed by them? Turns out, like a lot of things, it's easier to manage difficult emotions when you catch them early. Most people end up getting overwhelmed by painful emotions because they ignore them or put them off or kind of procrastinate on them when they're small and manageable and wait to deal with them until they're so big and overwhelming that they actually have to. But because they're so big and overwhelming, their odds of success plummet. On the other hand, if you can get in the habit of briefly acknowledging and validating your difficult emotions early when they first show up and are still relatively small, your odds of processing them and moving through them in a healthy way go way up, and you stand a much better chance of staying emotionally balanced and able to follow through on your best ambitions and goals. Number 2, they think about their thinking. Now, aside from ignoring your emotions, like we talked about in the last section, the other reason people tend to get overwhelmed by difficult emotions is because they unintentionally feed them with their habits of thought. Specifically, mental patterns like chronic worry or negative self-talk tend to feed and exacerbate difficult emotions and make them much more intense and long-lasting. Just a silly little example, a little bit of anxiety, like we all get a little bit nervous, we feel a little anxious, it's usually not a big deal. But if you feel a little bit of anxiety, but then spend 10 minutes catastrophizing and worrying about it, you're going to have a lot more anxiety after those 10 minutes. If you want to control your emotions, you have to learn to control your thinking. Most people are just not that aware of their mental patterns, and as a result, they find themselves at the mercy of and sort of overwhelmed by all of the emotions that those thought patterns lead to. So, for instance, chronic worry leads to a lot of chronic anxiety. Chronic rumination can lead to chronic anger and irritability. Chronic self-criticism tends to lead to chronic self-esteem issues or even depression. Successful people, on the other hand, have a habit of paying attention to their thoughts and their thought patterns, especially in stressful or emotionally challenging situations. And as a result of that, as a result of being more aware of those mental patterns, they're better able to manage them and not let them sort of run wild, which results in, among other things, less intense emotions and having an easier time sticking with your goals and good intentions. Number 3, they're compassionate with their mistakes. So one of the things I've really noticed that really sticks out to me now that I've seen it when I consider successful people in my life is that there are kind of 2 types of successful people. One type is very externally successful, but miserable on the inside. The other type is both externally successful and also has a level of calm and equanimity on the inside. And while there are a lot of factors that feed into this distinction, here's one that I think is just really underappreciated. It's hard to be sustainably successful when you beat the hell out of yourself every time you make a mistake or screw up. If you look at these externally successful but internally miserable types, they often have this really intense habit of getting critical and judgmental with themselves after mistakes or errors. They're sort of constantly ruminating on past mistakes. They're worrying about the consequences of mistakes in the future and just generally being kind of judgmental and nasty to themselves. But the ones whose external success is matched by sort of internal success, this internal calm and confidence, these people tend to be very compassionate with themselves. And even if they wouldn't use that term specifically, their overall attitude toward themselves when they make mistakes tends to be much more supportive and gentle, realistic, but supportive and gentle, rather than harsh and judgmental and critical. Number 4, they listen to their emotions, but don't trust them. While we're on the topic of splitting the world into 2 types of people, most people's relationship with their emotions often falls into kind of 2 extremes. On the one hand, there are people who are dismissive and avoidant of their emotions. As a result, they understandably don't really know much about their emotions or how to manage them well when they show up. The second type is kind of obsessed with and overly focused on their emotions. And as a result, they frequently get lost in their feelings and end up making a lot of decisions based purely on how they feel as opposed to their goals and values. On the other hand, people who tend to be successful often take a more middle ground approach to how they deal with emotions. They're aware of and sensitive to their emotions, but they also don't put blind trust in them and just do whatever their emotions are pushing them to do. Instead, they see emotions as a source of potentially useful information, but it's not the gospel truth either. And in challenging situations, when push comes to shove, they tend to use values rather than emotions to make important decisions. Number 5, they update their expectations frequently. Now, expectations are powerful beliefs about the future and how things should be, how people should be, how events should happen, that sort of thing. But the thing about expectations is they're kind of like apps on our computer. They often tend to run in the background, and they're running and they're using sort of resources even though we don't necessarily know that they're running. The result is we have a lot of these expectations, these programs running in our brain that we almost never look at or inspect. And one of the consequences of this is that we can end up thinking and feeling and acting in ways that are actually contrary to our goals and values because we have these little programs, these expectations running in our background that are exerting an effect even though we don't consciously think much about them. Now, one of the more provocative things I'd like to encourage people to do is experiment with just not having expectations. But a lot of people are pretty resistant to this idea. So then what I typically tell people is if you insist on having expectations, you should insist on updating them frequently. A lot of people end up falling into patterns of self-sabotage and other bad habits because they're still operating out of expectations that are very old, often from childhood. On the other hand, successful people have this interesting habit of continually, really regularly reflecting on and thinking about and updating their expectations to make sure that those expectations are realistic and align well with the current situations or contexts that they're in. In other words, they have realistic expectations because they're taking it upon themselves to think about and update those expectations. Number 6, they're serious about self-care. Now, it's very hard work to do all the stuff that we've been talking about so far, to manage difficult emotions well, to think accurately and clearly, especially when you're stressed out or very emotional, to update your strong beliefs and expectations to be more realistic, to manage mistakes and criticism with compassion and support rather than judgment and negative self-talk and stuff like that. So there's all these like pretty intense psychological functions that we need to be able to perform on a regular basis in order to be both happy and successful in just about every area of life. And yet a lot of us don't do a whole lot to support our minds in successfully accomplishing all these functions on a regular basis. It's a little bit like if you were a professional athlete, but ate like crap all the time, or if you owned a Ferrari, but never got the oil changed. Success depends on a healthy mind, and a healthy mind depends on healthy habits. Now, the term self-care often gets a bad rap because it's come to be associated with these really sort of superficial acts of kind of comfort and pleasure, things like, I don't know, bubble baths and essential oils and stuff like that. But in reality, self-care, it means establishing and maintaining, even when it's hard, habits and routines that support your health and well-being. Successful people, they understand, they really get it, that doing your best work, functioning at kind of peak performance, it requires being mentally and emotionally strong and sharp. But more importantly, they get that that just doesn't happen by magic. Those things require time and investment. You have to invest in your emotional health and well-being. If you want your mind to work for you, you have to work for your mind. Number 7, they're willing to be emotionally vulnerable. Now, emotional vulnerability, it's another one of these terms like self-care that it's become very popular recently, and it gets tossed around and has kind of this silly, superficial connotation because I think a lot of people use it in this very silly or superficial way. But it's not silly or superficial when properly understood. To be emotionally vulnerable means that you are able and willing to talk about how you really feel, especially when it's tough. Not only is this super important for your own emotional health and well-being, we talked all about this in the first point earlier on, but it's really vital if you want to maintain healthy relationships in your personal life, in your work life, in any area of life, really. Successful relationships, which are just about always the foundation of success in any realm, all of that depends on having solid, successful relationships. Well, those relationships themselves, they often depend on people being willing to talk and communicate about how they actually feel, what's bothering them, what they hope for, what they're afraid of. And if you can't talk honestly and clearly about these things, it's going to lead to a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of confusion, a lot of friction, and eventually a lot of resentment and lack of trust. So to sort of sum up, success in any area of life depends on good relationships. And good relationships depend on the ability to be emotionally vulnerable when necessary. Successful people understand this. And so while they don't walk around with bleeding hearts all the time, talking about every little feeling they have, right? When it really matters, occasionally there are moments where what's called for is to be at least a little bit emotionally vulnerable, a little bit honest about how you're actually feeling. They are willing and able to step up to the plate and do that. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful. If you'd like to learn more from me about how to build healthy habits of mind, I write a free weekly newsletter called The Friendly Mind. It goes out every Monday morning and it's full of practical, evidence-based advice for emotional health and well-being. I also lead a 4-week masterclass called Mood Mastery, where I teach a small handful of motivated students the essential skills and practices required for emotional strength and resilience. If you're interested in either the newsletter or Mood Mastery, please check out the links in the description below. Cheers.